Lola. So the professor's name is pronounced Gelodwas. Oh, you're on mute.
Gladios. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Gelodwas. Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth webinar, which is a series of 4 webinars on 4 weeks in November. It was organised to coincide with the first year of the genocidal war against Tigray. My name is Leandra Lola Gebakida. I'm a member of Meketa Tigray UK. Meketa is an all-inclusive democratic panel for people from Tigray. We have been working with the TYN, the Tigray Youth Network, an association of young Tigrays who have been campaigning tirelessly to raise awareness of the genocide in Tigray. Meketa Tigray and TYN are part of the global diaspora. We are happy to welcome our distinguished panelists who will be speaking today about the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Tigray. I'm also happy to welcome our 2 moderators, which will be Sally Kebbel and Gail Warden. They will be leading today's webinar. The closing remarks will be given by Rowena Kasai, a member of the TYN. I would now like to introduce the first of our moderators, Sally Kebbel. Sally Kebbel is a former UK Labour MP and Government Minister. She served in the Ministry of the Department of Transport, Local Government and Regions, and then for the Department of International Development. After leaving government, she served with the influential Treasury Select Committee in the UK Parliament, scrutinising government, economic, fiscal and monetary policy. She also steered through Parliament the UK Debt Relief Developing Countries Act, the Vulture Fund Act, to stop the financial exploitation of developing country debt. After leaving Parliament, she was appointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury to set up a global advocacy agency to bring together the development, relief, and advocacy work for the world's 88 million Anglicans. Originally a journalist, she is the author of many articles and publications. Born in Germany, she has lived and worked in the USA, Australia, South Africa, as well as the UK. Our second moderator will be Gail Warden. Gail is a freelance consultant and began working with the TPLF, EPRDF from 1989 in London, editing their magazines and carrying out press officer duties as the war against the Derg climaxed and then concluded. She spent 6 years working for Charter 88, the campaign for constitutional reform here in the UK. In 1998, she worked with Speaker Dawit Yohannes in Ethiopian Parliament as a Human Rights Commission coordinator. She then transferred to the Ethiopian government spokesperson's office as a press officer during the first half of the border war with Eritrea. From 2000, she was a consultant at the Ethiopian Embassy in London and also wrote articles. She is now semi-retired, but continues with her public relation work, consultancy, writing and editing. Thank you. I'd like to now hand over to Sally Kebble. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much, Leandra, for your introduction. It's a real honour to be able to join you and be a moderator, along with Gail Warden, for this final webinar on the genocidal war on Tigray. And many congratulations to Meketa Tigray and to TYN for organising this excellent series, which over the past month has looked at some of the key issues in this conflict. As the last of these webinars, this afternoon, we'll be looking at the continuing humanitarian crisis in Tigray, and we will also be looking to the future, to the challenges and opportunities of rehabilitation and socioeconomic reconstruction in post-war Tigray. It's all of these are issues that are right at the top of people's minds. The humanitarian crisis, the continuing crisis, has been horrendous, and we've seen many of the scenes of it in the introductory video. And just at the end of last week, we heard someone from the UN saying that in Tigray, 9.4 million people are now living their worst nightmare as a result of the humanitarian crisis. And much of that is what will have to be recovered during the reconstruction. So we'll be looking at what's needed to repair the devastation inflicted on Tigray's infrastructure by war, to repair the schools and hospitals trashed by invading armies, rebuild the factories, restock the farms, replant the fields, and deal with the trauma of the thousands of detainees who've been rounded up and held right across Ethiopia, in particular in the most recent weeks. The trauma of the women affected by the appalling sexual violence. There'll be the need to improve health and education outcomes for children and provide for the orphans who will need new carers and new homes, and to enable the young men and women who've been serving in the Tigray Defence Force to reintegrate into civilian life, and of course to build a stable economy so that Tigray can transition away from reliance on humanitarian aid in whatever post-conflict political settlement is finally reached. And in a wider Ethiopian context, which will be equally challenging, the country's economic growth down from 9% pre-pandemic to an estimated 2% this year, official inflation running at over 25%, and the UN estimating the war has drained over $1 billion from the national coffers. So these are huge challenges to reconstruction, but there are also very great opportunities in the post-war reconstruction, which our speakers this afternoon will explore. Timing is tight, so just a word on housekeeping. Each speaker has 15 minutes, and my co-moderator and I have agreed that there'll be a 2-minute warning to speakers to make sure there's time for questions. And if you've got questions, please put them either in the chat box or on the Q&A. Now to turn to our first speaker to explore some of the challenges and opportunities of rehabilitation and socioeconomic reconstruction in post-conflict Tigray. He is Mukesh Kapila, someone who needs little in the way of introduction and has been a very active participant in this series of webinars. Mukesh Kapila is Professor Emeritus of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester in the UK, and a senior advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. More than that, he's an author, writer, distinguished public and media speaker whose contribution in the field of humanitarian affairs and international development has been widely recognized, not least by the award of a CBE, the Global Citizenship Award from the Institute for Global Leadership, and a Special Lifetime Achievement and Service Award from the Californian Legislature. With qualifications in medicine, public health and development from the Universities of Oxford and London, he's worked for the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the United Nations, World Health Organization, and international foundations of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, to name but a few organizations. He's been a real inspiration to many people working in development and humanitarian affairs. Mukesh, we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sally, and I'm glad to join this fourth seminar, and give me also the chance to thank the thousands of people that I understand listened in to, I should say tens of thousands of people who listened in to the previous seminars, and of course they can be seen again. Now, this particular seminar focuses on the humanitarian side and also looks forward, because we do know that however terrible wars are, even genocidal wars, they do come to an end, and there will be a future, and the best way to plan for the future is in the present. So I'm very glad that we are not just talking about the horrors of the present and the past, but we are going to actually look forward to the future, because there is a future. But more of that really later on. Meanwhile, just to give, I was reflecting on how do we provide a succinct statement on the humanitarian situation as currently prevails in Tigray and the surrounding areas. And that really made me think a little bit of my own experiences over the last 30 years in many, many, many humanitarian contexts, and wonder the question that I've always wondered whenever I've been in similar situations, and that is, what is humanitarian? And how do we actually assess need? I mean, how do we actually decide one person's need is greater than another person's need? Or how much is a need? And how do we measure whether or not we are meeting those needs? Because if you don't have a clear methodology for doing such analysis, then there are always the people who will be saying, oh, well, this is all lies, this is all propaganda, everything is all right. And you see all of that from the trolls on the social media around the Ethiopian conflict. So for those of you who may not know, we do have in the international community quite effective measures for measuring the human needs in different ways, and they include the usual indicators about health, nutrition, and the most important and useful indicator that I find from my experience is really malnutrition rates, because malnutrition is a kind of summary indicator of the availability of food, of the right types of food. It's also an indicator of access, and it's also an indicator of the state of well-being of the most vulnerable members of the community, usually children. So if you were to say that now in Tigray, according to the best statistics that I have seen, we've got global acute malnutrition rates of somewhere between 20 and 30%. And in neighboring Amhara, the rates are probably around 5 to 10%. Afar is slightly worse, but they are still much less than Tigray. So it gives you an understanding of really the severity of the humanitarian problem, principally in Tigray, but also in the surrounding areas. There is, and that is manifested all the way through into indicators around healthcare, around education, around water and sanitation, and the basic functions of being able to live in any society. I mean, I could bore you with a long, long list of statistics. And the only thing I would say about the statistics is that they're progressively getting worse. So it's really quite an academic point, whether it's 8 million suffering, or 9 million suffering, or 7 million suffering. The fundamental point is that all the indicators of need in every sector of human survival that you can think of is in the red and moving in the wrong direction. Now, again, in my experience, having looked at and been part of, worked in many, many extremely difficult crises, some of a genocidal nature, as in Darfur or in Rwanda or in around Srebrenica in Bosnia, I think from those comparative indicators, definitely the situation in and around Tigray is the worst that I have myself seen in 30 years by the indicators, and one of the some of the worst in human history since the Second World War, in relation during a conflict situation, as caused by conflict. If you, in very gross figures, somewhere the UN has estimated a requirement for about $1 billion of assistance, of which actually the world has provided around 600 to 700 million. So, and there's a gap of 300 million. However, these dollar numbers are fairly meaningless because people can't eat money, and money can't be translated into means for survival with the humanitarian blockade that is going on. So the problem in Ethiopia is not the lack of money. It is simply the ability of the money being turned into life-saving goods and services and made accessible to people who need them most. Of course, many people are suffering in Tigray and now in the surrounding areas, but there's an important difference. There is no equivalence here. Well, when you look at all the social media commentary, some of them say, but well, bad things are also happening in Amhara. There are humanitarian needs there also, undoubtedly. In fact, there are needs all over the country because the whole country is at war. But only in Tigray, only the people of Tigray, inside Tigray, and Tigrayans outside Tigray and the rest of Ethiopia are either under humanitarian blockade or been incarcerated in camps, or are afraid to leave their homes in case they are taken up by vigilantes, which are roaming the streets of many Ethiopian cities. So there is no question that this genocidal conflict, by and far, proportionately affects Tigrayans worst. And even in Amhara and Afar regions where people are suffering because the war has reached them, there is no blockade as such. Obviously, security considerations mean that sometimes humanitarian agencies cannot get to places where there is active fighting going on. But that is a decision made by humanitarian agencies to not work in areas where there's risk to aid workers. It is not because the authorities of a region have said, sorry, you can't help anyone because these people are under blockade. The denial of humanitarian aid to Tigrayans is an extremely strong indicator of why this is a genocidal conflict. Because if you're embarked on a genocidal venture, then clearly it's pointless to worry about humanitarian assistance, because in a genocide, you're concerned with the existentialist destruction of your opponent. And what is the point of providing humanitarian assistance then? So this is definitely one of the dimensions of a genocidal conflict. Now, the question really is, are we doing enough for humanitarian provision in Tigray? Of course, you can say, well, there is a blockade, therefore aid cannot go in, and less than 10% of food aid that is needed has gone in. Virtually zero health care is going in, and whatever is happening is from goods and supplies that were there before, or small amounts that are trickling into Tigray. And as a consequence, I don't have to say more, the situation is getting worse and worse. But my critical comment would be that is to ask why we cannot do more. Why do we take that as it is? Now, I worked in many other situations. Most recently, for example, in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan, which were under embargo by the genocidal regime of al-Bashir, the previous regime in Khartoum. And no aid could go into Nuba Mountains. But the people had figured out a strategy, and outsiders had also figured out a strategy of bringing aid into the Nuba Mountains, and also, by the way, into Darfur. So my appeal to all well-wishers and people of a humanitarian mindset is that we need more courage on the behalf of, by humanitarian workers and humanitarian agencies. Blockades of this sort are never 100%. There can't be. So I feel that we humanitarians are not doing enough and taking enough robust measures to get aid into Tigray. We're just kind of paralyzed by this idea that everything's a blockade and there's a war going on and therefore aid can't go in. So maybe things are going in and the people for security reasons don't want to say very much. But I feel that humanitarians and aid workers may start taking risks to defy the front lines and take aid in, trickle it in whatever way we can through neighboring territories. This is going to cost lives, perhaps, of the aid workers. And I think at least 20, 30 or 40 aid workers have already lost their lives in the last year or so. But that, of course, is, and while every life is a loss, clearly many hundreds of thousands have lost their lives on the victims have died. So that's my first thing. We can do much more, we should do much more, and we should be much more creative in bringing aid in, taking risks, physical risks if we can, as we did, for example, getting aid into Afghanistan in a previous generation of conflict, as we did in Sudan, as I mentioned, as we did in South Sudan, as we did in Bosnia and in many other places where despite terrible war, aid kept on flowing in despite obstruction. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think much more could be done in terms of building this resilience and self-assistance capacity of the besieged population. Of course, it's easier for me to sit here and say that, but in practical terms, as I saw, for example, in my experiences in Sierra Leone, which was under a terrible regime at the time of the RUF, and in Liberia, which was even more awful in the worst, there were ways of building up the resilience of people even within the conflict. And so those are the two things I would recommend that we do much more of, because I don't think there is going to be any relief to the current situation. We've got to work with the current situation. There is no end to it. Suddenly, the embargo is not going to be stopped. So we have to find a way into and around it. Now, turning briefly into to future considerations for the last few minutes. Well, I think a humanitarian, a man and woman and child, does not live by bread alone, as I think it has been said by someone better qualified than me. And what that effectively means is to restore the human in humanitarian. That means attending to the dignity aspects of aid and assistance strategies. And time again, I have found that the resilience and survival capability of a population that is living under terrible attack by opponents, their survival is decided not just by their food and water and whatever aid they can get, is decided by whether or not the people have maintained their pride, their dignity, their sense of humanity, their sense of themselves as human beings, if you like. So these seminars, in a small way, from a safe distance, but other efforts to support the people, show that they're not forgotten, they will never be forgotten. And also trying to build up the capacity of the local communities. There are doctors still in Tigray, there are nurses, there are farmers, there are all sorts of people there. There are teachers. Schools are completely stopped, but there are teachers still there, and doing whatever we can to restore their agency to be able to carry on, even with what little they have, is extremely vital to keep that dignity alive, if you like, because it's on that dignity that is going to base by whatever happens. Turning to the future, then, in that particular context, we have to realize that the recovery of Ethiopia, including Tigray, or Tigray and Ethiopia, depending on where Tigray ends up as a political entity, depends entirely on the politics that is going to prevail at that particular time. So what that means is that in order for the services to be recovered, infrastructure to be restored, electricity which is gone, water supplies, usual things that anyone needs for a society to function, all that is going to require a great deal of thought in terms of what sort of society the people of Tigray wish to construct after this is over. You know, as someone else better qualified than me has said, no crisis should be wasted. And what that means is, here's an opportunity to think about what sort of a future Tigray wants. And one thing we can say is that the other parts of Ethiopia and the history of Ethiopia is no model in that regard, because there is nothing but unmitigated horror that the history of Ethiopia in the decades that have gone by have shown us. There is almost nothing to learn from Ethiopian history, except that these are horrible people who have done horrible things to each other, and they have allowed themselves to be ruled by generation after generation of horrible rulers. That's the most important consideration, the humility required to understand that the future of Tigray, or the future of bigger Ethiopia, if there is still a bigger Ethiopia, cannot be a return to the past, cannot be modeled on all the different experiments that have been done over the last 30, 40, 50 years or longer, because they were all failed. There is nothing to learn from Ethiopia in regard to its history that brings us any idea of what a successful Ethiopia or its different regions is going to look like. It's going to require completely new thinking. Once we realize that, then actually it's hugely liberating to think of completely different ways of a political future, of a future development vision, of a future vision for human progress in that part of the region, whether in Tigray or beyond. So my closing remark is simply to say that, number one, think more courageously and act more bravely, take more risks in getting real physical, practical aid into Tigray, regardless of what is going on, and taking the risk that this will mean a risk to life and limb for those who wish to do this. There are plenty of models that have been tried elsewhere to do that. And I think it's difficult, but it's possible. Number two, hold up the capacity of the Tigrayans and ensure that whatever we do, we bolster that, because we're going to be living with this for months to come yet. Locusts are there, agricultural, we already know, is destroyed. So we're talking here of not just ability to survive today, but at least the ability to survive the next year. And that requires a kind of modulated aid approach, not just a relief provision approach. And that, I think, can happen right now, regardless of the war. You know, wars don't happen. And finally, we need a new development vision for recovery, because it is quite true that Ethiopia was making 8% GDP growth rate and all those kinds of things. But the fact is that the model of Ethiopian development under any regime of the last few decades dissolved on the first day of the war. And so there is nothing to learn from there. There has to be a different way. By design, it has to be different. Otherwise, we will default to continuing the business as before, or going back to the old models. And that, I fear, is going to be the most disastrous legacy of this whole conflict. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mukesh, for a really inspiring speech with some very thought-provoking statements from yourself. I took away particularly putting the human back into humanitarian, and also the need for a whole new development vision, which is indeed a really big challenge, but also a very, as you rightly said, inspiring and reinvigorating way to look at the future and what might come out of the terrible crisis that we're seeing today. Our second speaker also needs very little introduction. She is Dr. Fiona Meehan, who's a rural development and gender specialist who's been involved in Tigray since the early 1980s and will be very well known to many of the people who are watching from around the world. She has been working in Tigray, coordinating an international NGO and a consortium, and then working for the TPLF Foreign Relations Department during the 1980s Ethiopian famine and civil war. After the war, she worked in Ethiopia for 12 years with the Relief Society of Tigray before returning to Ireland to complete her PhD on smallholder agriculture and female-headed households in Tigray. Since then, Fiona has worked as a lecturer in development studies and an independent researcher and consultant for a wide range of international NGOs, and also for Tufts University, which has done such inspiring work also over the past year during the conflict. Fiona, you've taken part in previous webinars in this series, but we very much look forward to your contribution this afternoon. Over to you, Dr. Fiona Meehan.
Thank you very much, Sally. And thank you very much to the organisers. It's been a privilege to be involved, the extent to which I have been in this series of Forza webinars. I've learned a huge amount in it, and I would just like to pay tribute to the enormous level of work that the organisers have all put into it, as this will be the last one. The topic I've been asked to speak on is a massive one and difficult to do justice in 15 minutes. So I'll just make a few comments on overall post-war reconstruction issues, and then particularly focusing on women farmers and especially female households. I'm confident that Jan Nyssen, who I see has joined us, will cover the details of the agricultural sector much more competently than I would. But first, I think we need to remember that before this war started, Tigray was already in a process, an extended phase, if you like, of reconstruction and development following two previous wars. The war and civil war and famine of the 70s and the 80s devastated the economy of Tigray, and the war with Eritrea also exacerbated that, and there were decades of deliberate underdevelopment before that. So nevertheless, the progress made in those 30 years has been absolutely phenomenal in terms of building up economic infrastructure, increasing agricultural production, delivery of services, and it's been utterly devastating to see the extent to which that has been decimated just within a short period of 12 months. And it would be very easy to be disheartened in looking at the scale of the challenges involved in rebuilding that. But I think it's important also to focus a little bit on what hasn't been destroyed and what still remains. Even, for instance, thousands and thousands of kilometers of terracing, reforestation, barren lands redeveloped and brought back into production. Though that is still there, that hasn't been destroyed. But I think of particular relevance is the level of knowledge and skills and experience that have emerged, that have developed and emerged from that 30 years of development. That is still there, and underpinning the success of that development process has been, of course, the people of Tigray, and referring back to what Professor Kapila spoke of, the level of resilience. And I think particularly the social organization and community focus and mobilization, particularly in rural areas, has underpinned those 30 years of development and will continue to underpin the reconstruction and recovery process. So it's not actually going back to square one, despite the destruction of physical infrastructure and devastation of services. And in that respect also, it's perhaps worth referring to and look in the reference to building up of Indigenous capacity, that was a massive focus during these past 30 years. And it's perhaps relevant to highlight the role of the Relief Society of Tigray, who were formed in '78 and were a key partner in the cross-border operations during the 80s, where there was an innovative approach taken to getting aid in, despite the blockade on Tigray by what was then the Derg regime. And I find it a startling difference in terms of how willing governments were at that point to say, let's say, be flexible about issues around sovereignty in supporting cross-border areas without operations without Ethiopian government support, and that's been significantly missing this time round. But also the role of, right at this point, the Relief Society of Tigray, much of the distribution of aid that's taken place under extremely different circumstances during this past year has actually physically been done by the Relief Society of Tigray, including the aid that was brought in by other actors. And I would very much hope that we will see a support for continuing to build up and back and finance that Indigenous capacity as part of the recovery process. So looking at post-war reconstruction, you've still got, Tigray is still a predominantly rural area, so I'm going to focus in more on the rural development aspects and the agriculture. There has been a tremendous amount of work in upscaling production, working on economies of scale, agricultural production, specialization, and a range of policies during the past 30 years. But despite increases, but a lot of the large-scale production is still predominantly Western Tigray, and a lot of Central and Eastern Tigray are still very, very small rural landholders with very small landholdings, operating on semi-subsistence agriculture. And I think it will be really, really critical that post-war policy focuses on supporting and keeping that rural population in place and building up very small scale landholders. It will be tempting to push for increases in economy and scales because the needs for increased food production will be enormous. But looking at even, say, before the war started, there were significant problems with unemployment in rural towns. There was still a lot to be done in terms of building up the economic infrastructure and employment. And with the devastating destruction of economic infrastructure, of enterprises, there is going to be significant unemployment and service provision challenges within within towns of Tigray after this war. And one thing it will not be able to do is absorb increasing numbers of newly landless, small-scale rural migrants moving into the towns. So while there are valid issues around the long-term sustainability of the very, very small landholdings, I think now would not be the time to start moving on that, or to try and move them into other economic sectors. And that it would be more important to adopt a really integrated rural community development approach. And that includes service provision in the rural areas, diversification of sources of income, where agriculture alone is not sufficient to sustain households. And also ensuring that more of the value chain, more of the income that comes from the rural production actually stays within the rural economies and goes back into stimulating growth within the rural areas, rather than, as was tending to happen more and more, most of the value was going into the urban economies. And I think in looking at building up rural communities post-war, of particular concern would be the role of women farmers, and especially the women heads of households. Partly because of the previous war and loss of people within those wars, but also some social factors like very young marriage ages for women and older ages for men. So you have higher proportions of widows. High proportions of female-headed households have characterized a lot of the rural populations and areas. It varies from place to place. My own research found from about 10 to over 30%. It's also still the case before the war that female-headed households were continually ranked among the poorest of the households and the most food insecure. And the particular constraints at that time, and they will continue in post-war, where they tended to have much smaller areas of land. The lack of adult male labour is clearly a major factor with traditional agricultural production. They had less access to assets like credit, livestock, less access to the higher return income sources. They were constrained in terms of mobility and being able to travel, which is a constraint for some of the more higher earning agricultural activities because of domestic work, and also social constraints on women traveling far from the home. But of particular focus, I think, for consideration in post-war policy is the extent to which the majority of female-headed households were not able to farm their own land because of the constraints on labour and other assets. So most of them were forced to crop share. That means occasionally renting for cash, but mostly they were renting their land to other farmers in return for a small share of the crops. The result of this was that, one, their incomes remained very, very low. They weren't getting the full benefit from their land. Secondly, the production on the land tended to be underutilized because farmers were not as inclined to invest as much in land that they were renting temporarily as they would in their own more long-term land. And also because they weren't actively farming, they were not benefiting. This is what we discovered through research we did when I was working with the rest. They were being left out of a lot of the agricultural production programs, the development programs that were being funded in and that were focusing on increasing agricultural production. There was a tendency to give women chickens, basically. And it's extraordinary. In 40 years of involvement in development, we've gone through so many different paradigms, so many different approaches from poverty reduction, etc. But one thing that has stayed consistent is giving women chickens. The difference is we called it poverty reduction 40 years ago, and now we call it empowerment. But I think too, one unfortunate result of this war, sadly, will be that while we don't have any firm figures on losses yet, we do know from reports that of civilians killed, say during the massacres, the majority, significant majority of those have been male. We also know that inevitably thousands have died in the armed forces of Tigray. So there is going to be an inevitable significant increase in the proportion of female-headed households living in both rural and urban areas. So I think what for me is really, really critical, without going into the details of what those policies should be, is that post-war reconstruction policy needs to be designed around and to incorporate the recognition of female-headed households as an integral and central part of the agricultural workforce and of the rural economy, and that the constraints be addressed directly within those policies. There's tended to be, particularly in terms of enabling women to farm their own land and to participate as full economic participants. There has been a tendency to see female-headed households as a kind of add-on group where you develop your policy and then you look at how to incorporate or how to accommodate female heads of households or how to help them, rather than seeing them as a resource. They're a problem to be solved rather than a resource. And rather than being treated as equal partners in the rural economy and within the reconstruction. So this, I think, will also mean reviewing some of the pre-war approaches and revising these. Now, some of these approaches have been very successful in increasing agricultural productivity overall, but I think inadvertently have actually in some cases led to an increased gender gap, an increased inequality between male-headed households and female-headed households, and gender inequality overall. And to take it as an example of that is the cooperative development. And the key factors of cooperatives, producer cooperatives or general cooperatives. And key factors in this has been a lack of awareness of the role that women actually do play in the agricultural production process and the extent to which they are involved in joint decision-making at household level, even when they're not actively, even when there is still a relatively traditional gender division of labour in play. The proportion of joint decision-making was 80-90% in many of the households in my own research work. And where the focus has been on strengthening the value chain, that's looking at inputs, the production, the processing, the marketing. These are all brought within the co-ops, and membership of the co-ops cooperatives tends to be one person per household, and that's generally the head of the household who is perceived as the man. And that means that all the supports associated with that particular production, sometimes it's maybe dairy cows, or it may be a general farmers cooperative, but the supports, the training for production, the credit access, the support with marketing, all of it is organised through the cooperatives, which means that the women farmers, the wives of those male farmers, are marginalised and often pushed out of their pre-existing role in the production process. And it means that the majority of the female heads of households, because they're not farming their own land, are not included in the cooperatives. So this inevitably means an increased gender gap in access to assets, in income, in skill development. And another aspect of that is where the increase in the marketing, the scale of production, means that the marketing then tends to bypass small local markets and community centres and delivers food or markets it directly to the major urban centres. And that lends to a kind of rural development model where it's almost like the spokes of a wheel, and the rural centres are treated predominantly as food suppliers for the urban centres. Whereas if you look at how it actually operates in the rural areas, if you do kind of social mapping, it looks much more like a web. You know, it's associations, very small rural markets, which play a key socioeconomic role in rural communities, both in terms of diversity of foodstuffs, petty trading, and a lot of the traders within those markets are women. But they're not then part of any of the larger programs, and they're continually bypassed. So it seems to me that a key focus for policy after the war should be developing those socioeconomic hubs and community centres. It doesn't mean, I mean, the increasing gender gap, it doesn't make, this is obviously not a deliberate policy. It's an inadvertent result of policies that are otherwise quite successful in some respects. It's not because anybody's sitting there saying we're going to marginalize the women, we're going to cut them out. It's about a lack of awareness. It's about a failure to look at stuff with a gender lens. I mean, if you're looking at agricultural production, if you can answer just a couple of key questions, as in who does what, who carries out what part of the process, who has access to credit, to inputs, who does the marketing, and who makes the decisions, that gives you a gender analysis. You know, it's not rocket science. It doesn't have to be incredibly complicated. A lot of it's very much common sense. But there's sometimes a lack of awareness of this. There's a need to strengthen joined up thinking and policy coherence. There have been some very good projects. There's a lot of efforts to help develop female-headed households' livelihoods. But I think first and foremost, what's really important is the shift from looking at female-headed households as a problem to be solved, as a kind of marginal group or a vulnerable group to be helped, and to see them straightforwardly as a resource. They will be a very central and hugely significant part of rural communities in agricultural production and economic reconstruction in the years to come. And so they need to be, policy needs to be designed around them, not treating them as an add-on group afterwards. And that for me, I think, is the key issue that I would like to leave you with. And just as a very last final point is the importance of recognizing the level and extent and the long-term impact of the trauma that's been suffered during this past year. And the importance of mainstreaming trauma awareness and support throughout all of the reconstruction policy and practice. And recognizing particularly perhaps that massacres and mass rapes often happened around this, in the same locations, which means that in those areas, you're going to have a very high proportion of highly traumatized women, survivors, heading up those households. And they are going to be, and very traumatized communities, particularly where the worst of the atrocities took place. And I think where the social organization of Tigrayan communities can provide every community can be a support community. So much of the work on reconstruction will involve working with groups, whether it's the cooperatives, whether it's the local development groups, the local baitos, the local administrations. A very basic level of trauma awareness and support could, ensure that all of those communities are basically support communities, in recognizing that the trauma will take time. It will have an impact on people's health, their mental health, their physical health, their energy levels, their sense of optimism. And many may not even recognize, say, a year ahead, why certain symptoms they have, how they link back, and what post-traumatic stress syndrome actually looks like. So I think that is one key aspect that I would like to urge people consider. So I think I'll leave it at there. And thank you. Thank you, Sally. I'll hand back now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Fiona. I think we all appreciate the depth of the experience that you have in Tigray and that you brought into the discussion this afternoon, and in particular, looking at the need for the point about capacity building, getting in humanitarian aid, which very much resonated some of the points that Mukesh was making as well. And also your concern about, I loved your quote, looking at stuff through the gender lens. And also, of course, recognizing the trauma and the need to deal with trauma and reconstruction, given some of the horrific scenes that we've seen going on, making sure that that's recognized and dealt with. So thank you very much. And having said that, can I now hand over to my co-moderator, Gail Warden. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you very much. brilliant contribution so far, and it is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Tesfaye Gebrselassie, an outstanding clinician. He's an accomplished healthcare manager, a teacher, a systems thinker, designer, implementer. He's a diplomat of the American Board of Internal Medicine in infectious diseases and clinical microbiology, but he's also an epidemiologist. He served the veterans in America, so he's been putting back together the people who have suffered the trauma of war, the physical and mental wounds that they've suffered, and he has won many awards for his work in this international awards in this domain. He's taught and supervised many students up to PhD level and internationally, as well as in the US. The US State Department credits him for saving over 300,000 lives during the 1985 famine because of his epidemiological assessment and the recommendations that he made. And in 2003, he established an antiretroviral therapy, HIV treatment practice setup, assisted the Ministry of Health in Ethiopia, CDC and partners, and NGOs involved in HIV treatment. He launched a free HIV treatment program in Ethiopia in January 2005, headed by, with the support of the then Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, and he has received awards of outstanding achievement from the Federal Ministry of Health and for the implementation of the President's Emergency Response for AIDS Response, PEPFAR, from the US State Department. He has chaired since 2011, the International Conference on AIDS and Sexually Transmitted Diseases, and attended the 2011 ICASA conference in Addis Ababa, and this again was to raise the standards of treatment for sexually transmitted diseases. And he's worked in regions, with regions, Ministry of Health, USAID and other partners. And he's also overseen the contribution of the private sector in the delivery of high impact public health services. The World Health Organization, the Global Fund and the Ministry of Health all acknowledge the value of his services, and which he has provided with the inclusion of the private sector, and conclude that they must be scaled up to include all regions. So, altogether did a brilliant job. So I have no hesitation in introducing and calling on Dr. Tesfaye to address us.
Yeah, I'm starting. Let me see if I can get my my presentation.
We seem to have lost Dr. Tesfaye. Dr. Tesfaye, are you there? Dr. Tesfaye? I think he was just getting his notes together, so no doubt he'll be back soon.
While we're waiting for him, could we go on to one of the discussants?
Oh, yes. Okay, good. Are they? Are they here?
Could I call one of them?
Oh yes, here's Dr. Galadros. Okay, we could call on Dr. Galadros to speak.
Shall we introduce him?
Okay. Right. Oh, Dr. Tesfaye is back.
Good.
Dr. Tesfaye, are you ready? Dr. Tesfaye, you're on mute. Are you ready?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, thank you.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Technology.
Yeah, I was trying to bring my presentation, and I just messed up everything. I'm not that technically skilled with computers, etc. But anyway,
brilliant in other domains.
Morning. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so much, Makata Tigray UK, for inviting me to participate in this important panel discussion as the country plunges further into more complex ethnic violence. I don't think I'll adequately cover the portion that was given to me to address the pre-war status, the total destruction of the system, the consequences of systemic disruption of healthcare, and then come up with approach to rebuild. But I'll try to give you kind of prescriptive type of presentations with the hope that you may pick up points and then ask me questions to elaborate on. So Tigray, before the war, had one of the most rapidly improving health delivery system in Ethiopia and had registered the best Millennium Development Goals in Africa and the world. The most important was poverty reduction. This was critical accomplishment. A lot of the credit claimed for reduction of communicable and non-communicable diseases is actually due to poverty reduction, if you can think about that. The 3 levels of care, primary, secondary, and referral tiers, were fully operational and continuously improving. It should be noted that the private health sector was anywhere else in Ethiopia had rapidly grown and caught up with the public sector in capacity, but was better staffed, cleaner, and much shorter turnaround time. It's also important to note that the public sector in Tigray encouraged and facilitated its growth by adopting, for instance, the public-private partnership, allowing it to utilize the public excess capacity to manage private patients so that they could make profit and stay in Tigray rather than migrate away. Both sectors suffered from lack of sustainable design of care model. Actually, through the entire Ethiopia, the care model is not well defined. And as you see, the care, particularly in the private sector, is fragmented, it's disorganized, it's disease-oriented and curative, it's episodic and discontinuous, it's physician-dependent, with very little to no task shifting. It therefore makes it cost-inefficient practice setup. Even the West cannot afford such a practice which is so episodic. It should have been wellness-oriented continuum of care, integrated with tasks shifted to the lowest level legally possible, and should include the environment and poverty during patient intake, which doesn't happen in Ethiopia. So the public sector is dependent on the 3 tiers: primary care, secondary care, and tertiary care. At the lowest level is the health post. There are about 5 health posts per health center, which is the hub for primary care. And above it is the general hospital, no, the primary care hospital, which supervises and sees the health centers. These were all functional in Tigray before the war. I'll give you some numbers to compare Tigray with the rest of the nation as to what they were accomplishing in terms of wellness-oriented primary care. So the war then happens. There is total destruction of the health system and beyond. The health system was systematically looted, and what was left of it after looting was systematically destroyed. As you all know, health facilities and healthcare workers are protected under the Geneva Convention. You also know that Tigray faced armed savages, soldiers of the Ethiopian Defense Force, Eritreans, Somalis, Amhara militia, were all drunk with hatred, with very little attention to international law. They lacked human decency and values. They pillaged, raped, violated innocence, massacred the youth, desecrated and humiliated the God-fearing and good-willing people of Tigray, and left it with physical and mental wounds and scars that will take generations to heal, if at all. So with such destruction, then what follows? I think it's not difficult to stretch one's imagination to see that there would be death, disorganization, diseases would be rampant, and uncontrolled, untreated. So 52,000 people were killed, 2.3 million. By the way, those numbers keep on changing, and there is no accuracy to them because, one, they are politically played upon, and two, there aren't reliable people working on numbers to feed us with the stats that we need. But suffice it to say that there were 2.3 million internally displaced. Some lucky ones made it across the Tigray River to the Sudan. But overall, there was increased mortality of acute, preventable, and treatable diseases. Chronic illnesses in Tigray, as well as in the rest of Ethiopia, had rapidly risen to the industrialized level because of affluence, inactivity, etc. But to give you a number, we estimate that 1 out of 6 people in Tigray would have hypertension or diabetes, or both together. Therefore, the death from diabetes, coronary artery disease, stroke, respiratory illnesses has escalated right now. Doctors have abandoned their posts because they could no longer face the patients with no medications and no supplies, particularly when it comes to patients like patients with cancer. They can't comfort them, they can't give them pain medications, and so they disappeared from their posts. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which would have been unheard of in Tigray, a mental illness due to shock and stress, is a reality because of the violent killing and sexual assault in Tigray. and it has yet to be addressed. To give you further numbers, again, I caution you about their accuracy, but if you look at hunger, we estimate that there were probably less than 1,000 people in Tigray pre-war who were hungry, going to bed hungry. Right at the beginning of the war, there were about 1 million that needed additional food. It's now 5.2 million. Rape, I don't have a baseline figure for that, but it's estimated anywhere upwards 12,500, according to numbers that I got from UK. Now, the other services that the Tigray Health Service was providing, the antenatal care, was superb. They scored 94% compared to 74% across the nation. Supervised delivery covered 73%, the postnatal care 63%, and for the nation, it was 48 and 33 respectively. The vaccination rate was fantastic, but could still have been improved. It was at 73% compared to 39% across the nation. This really was how good Tigray was doing because of determination and staff that was young and dedicated, and not because they stole the healthcare from the rest of Ethiopia and brought it up north. And in terms of the facilities, there were 712 health posts, functional and none at the moment. Health centers were 233 and 40 of them are left. Sadly, the health extension workers, which really galvanized the preventive aspect of medicine, are nowhere to be found. The hospitals, the primary and general hospitals, 29 and 16 of them respectively, 12 provide limited service at the moment, 21 no service whatsoever, and of the general hospitals, the status of the 7 of them is unknown. Tigray had 280 ambulances running. There are now 30. Most of them were taken to Asmara. Some were destroyed. Either hospital had an oxygen plant, which was completely destroyed and part of it taken away. The pharmaceutical company in Adigrat was completely demolished. This was a 9-channel penicillin and non-penicillin producing factory that not only Tigray but Ethiopia will miss. They vandalized the healthcare financing system and the health information system, which provided the electronic medical records. They were not going to benefit out of it, but they're just, their approach was to simply destroy and leave Tigray with nothing to rely on. So if I come back to the beginnings of reconstruction, what does sound healthcare need? It starts with health policy. This is assuming that there are infrastructures that are intact, which of course are not there. There is no power, there is no communication. If without technology, you're not going anywhere nowadays. And without power and communication, that technology is not going to be there. But you start with health policy and you build health structure. In the case of Tigray, there was public health sector and private health sector. The public health had health posts, health centers, and hospitals. The private had private clinics medium and high clinics and hospitals. These were appropriately staffed for the level of care. Again, if you're going to have an efficient, cost-effective care, you really need to shift tasks in third world countries. Otherwise, you are looking at a system that's copied from the West, which will be exceedingly expensive to implement in third world countries. Then you need supply chain. In Ethiopia, there is a federal system, and the private sector is really forgotten or sidelined. In Tigray, we linked the private facilities to the public, and that was working like a charm, i.e., the private health sector would get their share of medications and supplies from the federal system. Then there are standards. The standards that Ethiopia had were cut and paste from the West, and obviously were out of context. But this also raised the dilemma of how do you compromise on standards? That has not been resolved, and WHO hasn't addressed that either. But when life and limb are not at risk, you have to compromise, otherwise you'll provide no service whatsoever because you're blocked by standards that are not contextual. And the private sector should not be forgotten, but forced to self-regulate instead of the public sector dictating standards on it. How will Tigray rebuild? It was very interesting for me to listen to Fiona. Actually brought back, memories from the 1985, where there was nothing in Tigray. Empty shelves, yet lots of disease, lots of illnesses, chaos and death. And one really got stressed to continue to work in a situation like that. This is worse. What I'm seeing on videos, what I'm hearing from the country, and especially from people who have been to Tigray, this is horrible. I don't think there has ever been anything like what has happened to Tigray anywhere in the world in the past, and obviously not anything that we can draw lessons from. As we build Tigray, we'll obviously be dependent on large donations, more so than ever before. But I must caution that we should own the problem. If we don't own the problem and we're dependent on others telling us how to do it, then there won't be a rapidly built or recovered health system for Tigray. And whatever is implemented must be scaled up and sustained. And most donors, I am positive we have to negotiate. I have gone through this several times before. And they will negotiate honest development, governance of funds that are donated and not dictate their terms. So, given that all our efforts must count, every resource must go towards rebuilding. We cannot afford to repeat the past, where some NGOs were charging 66% overheads and silos for the benefit of renewal of funds were maintained. We should use appropriately credentialed experts when they are available. And I must also caution that we cannot close doors and we cannot afford to isolate Tigray and say it will depend on its own expertise. We have to employ integrated people-centered development, and we must shift tasks, again, to the lowest level possible when it's legal and safe. We must evaluate rigorously in order to terminate marginal and unsustainable programs. That's what I have as a prescriptive presentation, with the hope that you would have questions that I could answer later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a very brilliant outline of the situation, what's happened. I note the comparison with 1985. Grim, absolutely grim what's happened. The positive, taking the positives, you mentioned the determination of the people, you know, and the staff, the dedication of the staff, and this need to devise sustainable solutions and take things to the lowest possible level to make them fit the situation. So totally take that on board. And I do think Tigaru are among the most incredibly team-oriented people. They think as a team. That's why they're so successful on the military front as well, actually. But it counts in everything they do. They think of it in terms of, you know, strategy, and there are aims, there are clear goals. And I do think that came over very much in your speech. So thank you very much, Dr. Tesfaye, and I'm sure there will be questions for you later. And now I'll hand back to Sally.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gail. And thank you very much to all our speakers for covering key issues in both in the humanitarian crisis and also in the reconstruction and recovery in Tigray. And now we've got just about half an hour for questions and discussions. We've got 2 discussants and 2 questioners, and after that I've got a question also for, in particular, for Mukesh Kapila. So could we start with our 2 discussants? First, we've got Professor Gallo Dewasaraya, who was awarded his doctorate by Columbia University in 1990. He's authored several books, including The Political Economy of Transition and Globalizing Africa. He's founder and president of the Institute of Development and Education for Africa, and is currently Associate Professor of African Studies at Lehman College of the City University of New York. And then after that, we've got Dr. Abraha Durso, who's a medical doctor and pediatrician based in the West Midlands. Her involvement in Tigrayan child health and welfare issues and in the Tigray Development Association makes her an especially appropriate person to discuss some of the issues raised by our speakers. So if I could turn first to Professor Araya, if you would like to make your contribution. Professor Araya.
Hello there. Can you hear me well?
Yes,
hello?
We can.
Yes.
You can hear me, right? You can't see me though.
No,
Okay.
we can hear you, but we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Sally Kibble, for that kind introduction. I actually began by listening at the very end to Fiona, and then Gail Warden, and then of course Dr. Tesfaye. It's mostly on what Dr. Tesfaye presented that I'm gonna make my own contributions. So I'm not gonna repeat myself, with respect to what happened in Tigray, all of you are aware of that, of the immense destruction, humanitarian catastrophe, unparalleled in human history. But what I like to do is to give you a synopsis of what I jotted down for today's presentation. Apparently, as was mentioned, I am part of many organizations, Tigrayan organizations, Tigray Community Forum, Tigray Global Advocacy Group. There are so many of them, and then these are the voice of the Tigrayan people, especially in the diaspora. And we did a marvelous job in terms of educating not the Ethiopian or the Tigrayan diaspora, but the Western world as a whole, especially the Congress people in the United States, members of Parliament in the UK, and the Irish Parliament as well. So they know very well what's happening in Tigray. So what I would like to do now is actually to probably supplement or highlight of the wonderful presentation by Dr. Tesfaye. I know him very well. I have known Dr. Tesfaye for a long time. We are also members in the same organization, Tigray Global Advocacy Group.
Could I just, Katin, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have got quite a number of presentations, so could you try to confine your remarks?
Yeah, I'm going to do, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So, as he told you, Tigray before the war had one of the best health facilities, but in my opinion, that best hospital system or health system in Tigray should be viewed in the context of the APRDF's developmental state agenda. It was for all Ethiopia, as a matter of fact. And with respect to public-private sector, the primary, secondary, and tertiary, that Dr. Tesfaye said all were functional before the war, he's right. With respect to public-private sector, also touched upon by Gail earlier, it was envisioned long time ago by Meles Zenawi in 2006, actually. In 2006, Meles wrote a brilliant article entitled Africa Development, Dead Ends and New Beginnings. And I reviewed that article and incorporated it in my book that was published in 2013. As Dr. Tesfaye said, patients are dying of diabetes and other things and what have you. And then the necessity of post-traumatic syndrome disorder. In fact, Dr. Tesfaye knows very well that we established in the Tigray Global Advocacy Group a post-traumatic stress disorder / medical committee for Tigray. And then we connected ourselves with the Eider Hospital in Meghaleh. And luckily for us, we found one psychiatrist, a doctor, who also works in that hospital. And he volunteered that he was going to work with us. However, we could not translate our agenda into action due to lack of communication. All communication networks are broken down in Tigray now. Telephone system and others are all broken down. So we have difficulties continuing the agenda of the post-traumatic syndrome thing. That's what by and large I want to say, but last thing I want to raise actually is what Dr. Tesfaye brought at the very end, This has to do with the reconstruction, as far as I'm concerned, integrated people-centered development. But it's going to be, it has to be very comprehensive now, because development requires reconstruction, it requires many, many things. Rehabilitating the people, constructing the roads, the schools, other institutions, many, many, many things actually. And it's going to require billions of dollars, as a matter of fact. And it will take time too. So that's what I want to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for those very insightful comments about people-centered development. That's much appreciated and draws out from some of the earlier speaker. Dr. Durso, could I call on you now to make your contribution, please, which again is 5 minutes, and then we go on to the questioners. So Dr. Durso, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Can you hear me?
Yes, and I'm sorry I got your gender wrong.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, others have said it, but I have to say my personal admiration for Makati Tigray and the Tigray Youth Network for organizing these 4 webinars, from which I have learned an awful lot. Now, Tigray has indeed suffered a most catastrophic and human and economic destruction. The statistics are pretty grim, and I don't want to bore you with them, except to say, for example, 80% of the health facilities, that is hospitals and clinics, were looted, vandalized, or destroyed. And as Dr. Tesfaye said, he didn't give the percentage, but 99% of the ambulances were stolen, that's taken out of the country, of Tigray, mostly to Eritrea, or they were damaged beyond repair. Now that, as we have learned in this, these 4 seminars, a formal determination of genocide is going to take an awful long time, if at all. So as Dr. Mukesh Kapila said, that life must go on, and the business of rehabilitation, reconstruction, and development must start as soon as possible. Now, I have been outside Tigray and Ethiopia for over half a century. So although I am from Tigray and I am of the Tigray people, sometimes I have the privilege of looking at Tigray and Tigrayans with a foreign, in inverted commas, eye. So in my view, Tigrayans have a number of rich human values and characteristics which have served them well in the past and should serve them well in healing, as a recovery and future development. So it may sound a bit of bragging, but I am looking at it with a foreign eye. Tigrayans are incredibly resilient. They are a cohesive people. They are very resourceful and incredibly hardworking. They are very honest and respectful of others. They put a very high premium on education. And there is virtually 100% school enrollment of children. In addition, Tigray has a lot of highly educated people, and this is in all fields of human development. Many are actually organized, it hasn't been mentioned yet, many are organized in their areas of specialty under the umbrella of GSTS, that is the Global Society of Tigrayan Scholars and Professionals. The invading armies have stolen many things, including saucepans and spoons, but there is one thing they haven't stolen, and that is the knowledge inside people's heads. And unfortunately, although we have had a lot of people who have been killed, most of the educated people have managed to survive, although we have lost quite a few. The destruction of Tigray is very disheartening, as you have been hearing it today, and as you have heard it from Dr. Tesfaye particularly. But it may be of some comfort to know that all the development that has been reduced to dust was accumulated only, and I repeat it, only in the last 30 years. Before that time, there was no either referral hospital or indeed many of the local hospitals. There was no Adigrat pharmaceutical plant. There was no Adwa textile factory. There was no Keze hydroelectric power. There were no wind turbines at Ashkoda. There were no universities. There were not enough schools, and only about half the children in Tigray were able to go to school until 1991. Famously, until 1991, when the Derg regime fell and the APRDF came to power, the only factory in the whole of Tigray was a flour mill at Quiha. Now, 30 years is more than a lifetime for young people like the ones in TYN. But for older people like myself, 30 years feels like yesterday. And 30 years is only a drop in the ocean of the some 4,000 year history of civilization in what is today Tigray and Eritrea. People both in Tigray and in the diaspora are determined to rebuild Tigray with the help of the international community. And as Dr. Galaudio said, it is going to cost billions. And hopefully the international community and the international organizations like WHO, that's the World Health Organization, and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, among others, will respond generously. GSTS has a 30-year master plan, a Marshall Plan for Tigray's development. This was, in fact, ready to go into action when the war broke out in November 2020. Now, GSTS are organized under their various specialties, including health, education, agriculture, water resources, gender development, which will be of special interest to Fiona, youth development, and environmental and climate change resilience. And very important, governance, because it is a lack of good governance that has caused all the problems in Tigray and in the rest of Ethiopia. But before we can get there, before the task of development can start, the war must be brought to an end, and we are still in a state of war. The de facto blockade must end so that people can receive badly needed humanitarian assistance like food, medicines, and fuel. The basic services like banking, telephone, internet service, and ground and air transport must be restored so that people can start to live. That is basically what I want to say, except to say, if I could say just a couple of words about GSTS, this Global Society of Tigrayan GSTS, Tigrayan Global Society, sorry, of Tigrayan scholars and professionals. They are organized by regional chapters. For example, there is one for Ethiopia, based in Tigray, which has an office and an office manager. There is North America, South America, and the Caribbean. The third one is Europe. The fourth one is Asia, Asia and Pacific. And the last one is Africa and the Middle East. And they're very well organized, and they are ready to put a program into action. So there is some hope, although it's very depressing. Tigray is not going to be left undeveloped. And as Dr. Tesfaye said, we should own the problem. And I think the Tigrayans all over the world, and I haven't realized how many Tigrayans there are in the world. You know, they're in all the continents of Europe except Antarctica, I think. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Dursu, for that very comprehensive overview and also information about the organisations. We have a question from Dr. Caroline Bennett. Dr. Bennett, would you like to put your question? Do we have Dr. Bennett here? If Dr. Bennett isn't there, or if there's a few technical issues, could I just ask if we also have a question from Estefanos Abebe. Is Estefanos Abebe here?
Oops. Hi, this is Dr. Bennett. I'm actually here.
Right, okay, good, thank you.
I hadn't been a panelist, so I was sitting in the audience listening. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I mean, again, I was here last week, and you know, it's both impressive, heartening, and devastating and heartbreaking to listen to these talks, but they are incredible, and thank you, everybody. I've got a couple of points that I'd like to make, and then a question that I would like to ask to anybody amongst the speakers who would like to answer it. But just very briefly, just let you know why I'm asking these questions. So I'm a genocide scholar, and my actual research expertise is post-genocide politics, but particularly the treatment of the dead. And so I look at mass graves, mass burials, identification efforts, and things like that. And so on listening through what everybody's saying, there's so many important points that have been brought across. You know, some of that very practical aspects of the logistics of dealing with, you know, a society that's been through massive conflict and suffering. You know, Fiona talking about the women. I think a point that's also important to think about in these societies is the ongoing support that is given not just to the women, but to the children who are born of rape, because that obviously is an incredibly important, vital thing about identity and about where you've come from, and about belonging, potentially about citizenship and things like that. There are questions about, you know, who deals with the dead, and it's a horrible thing to have to think about, but these, you know, pragmatic things of how do the dead get buried, who does rituals, who organizes and pays for identity things, you know, things like that. So I think, you know, thinking about these things in the future, the two things that I think are important to think about, which have kind of been said by people, but I think not explicitly. One is that support can't be 2, 5, or 10 years, that it has to be ongoing, and it's probably decades long support. The second thing is ensuring that it is culturally appropriate, because what we have seen time and again in post-conflict treatment and support is that it isn't done in locally culturally appropriate ways, and it's often kind of layered over, and local means of dealing with justice, of dealing with trauma, of dealing with history are seen as being kind of unimportant because we've got these international ways of doing it, and so bringing that in right from the fore is really important. And the question that I want to actually put to anybody in the panel who would like to answer it, and perhaps several of you, is what I haven't heard anybody here mention is reconciliation between the different factions. And how do you go about, or what do you think are the possibilities or the potentials of how to even start post-conflict in Tigray, across Ethiopia and across the region, of ensuring that we don't just get a political flip where the people who were the victims then, kind of retaliate again for that factions are able to come together, because in all of these societies, everybody has to go on living. Unfortunately, victims have to live with perpetrators, and it's part of how society does that. So how or what or why or where do you think about bringing everybody together to actually ensure an ongoing peace that allows everybody in Ethiopia to live there? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question, Caroline, which I will make sure gets answered. Okay. Have we got Estefana Sibebe, who is going to ask a question?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, I'm here. Yeah, can you hear me?
Great.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
can you hear me? Thank you so much, panel. It's been quite a constructive discussion. We have learned a lot of information from these ongoing discussions. We do appreciate. I just want to say one thing and just go straight into the question. I mean, economic recovery, it's got its own strategies, and Tigray has been, a well-organized region, and it had a functional health service one way or the other compared, everything being relative. So we're not going to, as such, reinvent the wheel in terms of the actual rehabilitation plan or recovery plan. We got quite adequate human resources, yes, I must admit. There are certain constraints in terms of financial injections in the rest of it. That needs to be addressed, and there has to be some form of robust partnership. Having said that, though, there has to be, the focus got to be what sort of legal, political, military, and administrative settlements are going to proceed from this activity, because there are direct dependencies on those issues. So having said that, the much anticipated report by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the determination by the United States government on whether genocide against Tigrayans has been committed are expected to be released in the coming probably few weeks. Now, do the panel think these reports will be markedly different from the discredited report on the joint investigation that we saw? This is my question, because it's very important, simply because the legal settlement might have some form of implications that have a knock-on effect on many things, because there are so many externalities and dependencies on the economic, political settlement. So are we expecting a different report? Thank you, Sally.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's great. We've got two questions for Mukesh. In fact, in a way, we sort of got three. And then we had Gail Warden wanted to make a comment on political reform. So I will be handing back to her once we've finished these questions, if that's okay. So Mukesh Kapila, and then could you answer these questions? First off, you did mention in your original presentation the fact that there would be the need for a new development vision, but you then, it would be really interesting to know what you think the key components of that might be. I think that it would be a huge help in thinking how things move forward. And to take in Caroline Bennett's question, does that include a role for reconciliation? Okay. So the new development vision and what role in that for reconciliation. And then the further question, which is from one of the organisers of this event, is that she likes the idea of a start new and fresh without looking back to Ethiopia. What can you share from other countries how to start anew? Okay. So there's three questions from you. I haven't seen anybody else with questions. If any of the other panel wants to answer, please can they indicate, but Mukesh, could you answer those three? And then if no one else is going to wants to come in, I'll hand back to Gail. So over to you, Mukesh.
Thank you. Let me comment on those points, but let me start with the last one about the new reports on genocide because they're relevant to it. Well, I don't know what the new reports are going to say, but one thing I can say is that any report on whether or not the situation in Tigray is or isn't genocide is of little value, because by definition, the genocide will have already been committed. It has no preventive value. It may have some legal value, but quite honestly, the only worthy body that can have any legal value is if the report is commissioned by the Security Council and results in some executive action. This is why the UN Human Rights Council report was fairly pointless, not because it was a bad report, which it was anyway, but quite honestly, it has no authority. I mean, I can declare genocide, you can declare genocide, anyone can declare genocide, you see, but it's only the Security Council in international law that has a mechanism. And this is what happened when I was UN head in Sudan and managed to get the Security Council to actually refer the situation in Darfur in those days of politics to what happened subsequently. Now, coming to the question of reconciliation, then coming to the development model, I think the one thing is for sure, history teaches us, Caroline, but you are, I think, a much more kind of experienced researcher than I am in these matters. But what I know is the practical side, and that is that there is no reconciliation ever, anywhere, without having justice. And justice cannot happen unless there is accountability. And accountability doesn't happen unless there is acknowledgement, if you like, you see. So the sequence of events, if you go back as to whether we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether we look at events in Sierra Leone or in Central America or anywhere else, we come to the fact that reconciliation is a long-term process, sometimes taking 2 or 3 generations, if you wish, as was the case in Kosovo or Srebrenica, where the thing still goes on in some senses, because reconciliation happens when the myths are rectified. And the myths are generated down society. And that will not happen unless we have accountability, justice, acknowledgement, memorialization, if you like. And the Germans, the post-Nazi Germans, are fantastic at that business. That's why we have a totally different Germany now than we did then. So it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in Tigray, Ethiopia, anytime now, anytime soon. It may happen within your lifetime, as you are younger than me. It ain't going to happen in my lifetime. If you like to say. So we have to understand, therefore, that the context of the future of that region, whether Tigray is part of Ethiopia or a separate country or whatever happens in the Greater Horn and all that kind of thing, or the Greater Africa even, if you like, is going to operate against a very live context of bitterness and everything that flows from that bitterness, with further cycles of violence that are almost inevitable, except just let's hope they're not extreme genocidal ones. Now, in that context, what is the role of development visions? I think what the role of development visions is to educate people so that they have a true awareness of their history, and they don't hide it, as the Japanese have tried to hide their behavior in the Second World War, even to the present day in Japanese education. And many Japanese people don't even know the worst things they did there. And this is one of the reasons why the problem with Japan and Korea and China continue, very different from the German experience in Europe. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, yes, development, learn the lesson from Ethiopia. The development of Ethiopia with huge improvements in health, education, was built on rubbish foundations. They were not sustainable. Ethiopia remained one of the poorest countries in the world. It was one of the most age-dependent countries in the world. And I know something of this because I was a senior aid official in the British government, shoveled millions into Ethiopia. Sure, if someone gave me millions, I can also show you, 20% growth rates. And if you give me enough money for my health sector, I'll give you a network of modern hospitals and healthcare centers and reduce infant maternal mortality. That's a rubbish model that Ethiopia but all it did was create dependency. All it did was give illusion to the Ethiopians that somehow they were somewhat immune to the laws of gravity. And meanwhile, because there wasn't the foundation of governance, There wasn't a foundation of a real creation of a people, if you like, whether a federated state or whatever. No wonder the whole thing collapsed on day one, if you like. Now, so what that means is that I think relying on a center in Addis to do the regional development, Tigray or elsewhere, is clearly a rubbish idea, if you like to see. So we will have to actually go back to grassroots, to the basics, give up the idea of national development, and actually think of the idea more in village community terms. And I think Fiona had some excellent ideas about the agrarian system, the foundations of the local economy, the skills and capacities that were needed to it, founded on decades, if you like, of a culture of survival, if you like. That's what we have to return to. Go back to the past, distant past, not the past of the last Derg period and subsequently, from which I think they've got nothing to learn, other than never again to have the model that's been promoted in Ethiopia by donors, by African Union and others in the last 30 years of misdevelopment and bad politics in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was something of a tour de force. Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, if no one else has any comments they want to bring in, no one else has any questions. Fiona has. Fiona, can I hand over to Fiona to add your comments?
You're on mute.
Okay. There's a couple of quick comments in relation to the issues around reconciliation and the issues around accountability. I don't know, again, what the new reports are going to outline, but I'm just thinking back to when EPRDF entered Addis, there was a significant, despite the level of atrocities that had been committed and the level of bitterness, there was a very surprising lack of revenge and retribution carried out at that time. And I think that the key aspect in that was the fact that from the beginning, there had been an announcement that war crimes trials would be instigated by Ethiopia under the new government. So there was a sense that there would be an accountability process. And that was a key factor in the lack of anger spilling over. What's going to happen this time? I don't know. I mean, regardless of the issue of the legal recognition of what's happened as genocide, the issue that to what extent people believe that what's happened has been recognized, has been acknowledged, and that there will be a process of justice will be a very, very important factor in what happens post-conflict. In relation to reconciliation, I would agree with Professor Kapila. I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime. I've been there through 3 wars against the Derg, the Eritrean war, and the current one. There is nothing that matches the sheer level of bitterness and betrayal and the lack of trust from what's happened in Tigray these past 12 months. There is no sitting down around the table with nice reconciliation sessions happening anytime soon. And a key factor in that will be at what point Tigray is safe. We don't know how it's going to spin out over the next months or within the next year, say in terms of political settlements, what's going to happen, even with the new transitional government. At what point can Tigray actually see itself as safe? With a very hostile Amhara region around to its south, a hostile Afar region to one side, and a hostile Eritrea. Yeah, you know, it's impossible to even consider speaking of an issue like reconciliation with any of those groups, as long as they are still live and present threats to the survival of Tigray people. So any question of reconciliation will be very tied in with what constitutional political settlements come down along the line. And I would say it's also dependent on a change of regime in Eritrea. I don't see any sense in which Tigray will ever feel safe as long as Isaias Afwerki remains in power. So a lot will need to happen, I think, before we can start talking about any level of reconciliation or possibility of it between those different communities.
Thank you very much indeed, Fiona, for those insights. And thanks very much to everyone who's taken part in this, all of the excellent speakers, discussants and questioners. We are going to have a summing up from the organizer. So can I hand over first to Gail Warden, who's going to make a point, and then is in turn going to hand over to Meketa Tigray to sum up what has been a really outstanding series of webinars that has highlighted so many of the key issues and challenges facing Tigray, both in the present crisis and as it moves forward out of that to fashion its own new future. So over to you, Gail. Thank you.
Talking about the future, Mukesh mentioned building back better and what should Tigray be like in the future, and he mentioned the very liberating possibility of having a different political future, and that reminded me, I've got a background in constitutional reform, so forgive me for beefing on about this, but voting reform is key. And already at the last election in September last year, instead of trying to introduce a very complicated process of proportional representation, what the TPLF did was stand in 152 seats out of the 190, and then the other 38 seats were available for opposition parties depending on their share of the vote. Now that sort of thing is very important because, as Dr. Derso said, the bad governance and lack of good governance has caused all the problems. And so you have to get that sense of participation. And I just remember an anecdote about when Meles met Chris Mullen, who was then the Africa minister, and it was during the Labour Party, it was during the general election, and the Labour Party obviously was standing, and Chris said to Meles, "Oh, I wish we had as many votes as you got." And Meles replied, "I wish I had fewer," by which he meant that he knew there was a certain amount of coercion, and also what he really wanted was multi-party politics, which was achieved in 2005, but then the opposition just messed it all up. I mean, you know, they won Addis and half of them didn't take up their seats. So I just wanted to put in that word of thanks to the TPLF for introducing that at least a small amount of proportionality, so that at least some opposition people would have a chance in the future of, you know, taking up their seats and feeling involved. Okay, that's all I need to say. Thank you very much. Wonderful series, very much, very, very valuable. Thank you, guys. Should I hand over to the question? Who should I hand over to?
It hands over to Rowena.
Oh, Rowena. Rowena, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Over to you for summing up. Thank you, honey.
Not to worry. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone who has tuned in to today's webinar. Just as brief context, our previous seminars tackled the atrocities committed in the war on Tigray, compared and contrasted the Tigray genocide with other communities that have experienced genocide. And last week's webinar was on how to get recognition of Tigray genocide and transitional justice issues. This week's discussion, of course, focused on the humanitarian crisis and economic reconstruction. A report compiled from the 4 webinars will be shared soon. And to find out more about the work of Meketa Tigray UK and TYN, please visit meketatigray.uk and tigrayyouth.network.org. Thank you to the moderators, speakers, discussants, and all participants, as well as our technical enabler, Rita Kasai, and a big thank you to the Genocide Narrative team that have worked so hard to organize this series of webinars. Thank you, and I hope you keep well.